the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. We are proclaiming liberty one show at a time, and the next one starts right now. We are here to finish up. It looks like we're going to finish up Matthew chapter 7. Well, we've been waiting for this for a little while now. We started in Matthew 1, going through a series all the way through Matthew 7, and it took us a little while because we had a couple detours in between, which was a God thing, so no problem there. And now we get to finish up Matthew 7. We just did Matthew 7.1, which is a portion of Matthew 7 last time, and now it looks like we're going to finish it up with Matthew 7.2. The other thing about this is it ends the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus's biggest kind of sermon, with the most amount of people, the well thought out, well organized, well conducted, targeted sermon. And so we see him finishing it up here in Matthew 7. And then, so he started in Matthew 5, and now it's finishing up in Matthew 7 here, Sermon on the Mount. So cool, just about finished. Glad you're joining me to end this whole Sermon on the Mount episode. And glad you're here. So what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to talk about gates, wide, narrow. We're going to be talking about trees and its fruit. And we'll be talking about builders, construction workers, the wise and the foolish. And that's how we're going to finish out Matthew chapter 7. And so thanks for coming by today. Now, why don't we just jump right in, because we finished at verse 12 last time. And so now we're jumping right in at verse 13, Matthew chapter 7. Here we go. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So, although this is a very clear, kind of simple, easy to understand portion here of the sermon, it's pretty, it hits life right on the head. Don't you think? Because if you think about it here, how much easier is it to go through life not worrying about doing the right thing all the time, right? It's pretty easy. It's easier than doing the right thing because the right thing is always going to be harder, right? If you want to skirt some things, say talking about school, right? If you had a chance, if someone actually passed you some information that gave you the answers for a test, is it easier to just study those answers or write them on your wrist or your hand and then take the test? Or is it harder to actually study all the chapters to get the same score on the test? The result will be the same in terms of what comes back on the paper, because you can study just as hard or get the answers and get 100% both ways. But one's going to be much, much harder to get that 100%, right? And so that's what it's talking about here. Jesus is saying he wants you to enter through the narrow gate. Don't worry about the wide, broad, open gate, because it leads to destruction. And he says many enter through it. So what does that say? That means a ton of people fall victim to this stuff. They fall victim to do the wrong thing. And believe me, I've done a lot of wrong things in my life. Everybody has. That's why we're called sinners, because we sin. The key, though, Jesus is saying, is enter through the narrow gate. Go the hard way, because it pays off. He says, if you go through the small gate, the narrow road, it leads to life, and only a few find it. So it says right there, Jesus is saying that not a lot of people want to do the right thing, the hard thing all the time. Most people want to do the wrong thing. Most people choose now the wide road, the broad road, the wide open gate. Why do they choose that? Because it's easier. That's why. Why don't we work out 365 days a year, at the gym? Man, because it's hard. Why don't we stick to our diet or our selective eating from January 1st to December 31st all the time, even if there's a cheat day? Because it's hard. And some people may be good at that, but I guarantee there's another area in their life that they take the wide road on all the time, right? We all have our vices. We all have our issues. We all have our tendencies that are more, negative for our life, but yet we still do that. Why? Because it's easier, but it leads to destruction. We know that. Why do people still smoke nowadays? Now, maybe vaping, it's still smoking. Why do people still do drugs? Why do people drink alcohol to excess? Why do people do things that they know destroys them? It's easy. You know what the harder thing is to do? Not to do that stuff. It's harder, especially if we have tendencies, especially if we have leanings towards that. Because everybody has their own leanings, their vices, their, things that are difficult for them to say no to. The key is not to keep on choosing the wide road all the time in life. If you keep on choosing the wide road, guess what? There's no way you're going to choose the narrow road. So you have to make conscious decisions to choose the hard way. And you're going to have to choose it a lot of times in life. If you want to follow Christ and his example, which is perfection, too difficult for us, but through sanctification, we can get to a point. And that point will lead us to the narrow road because we've been working on it, getting stronger, building our stamina when it comes to sin and choosing not to sin and choosing the narrow road and fitting through that narrow road. Not that it's only us, not that we're doing it on our own. It's that God is helping us. The Holy Spirit is leading us, guiding us, prompting us. And with that, with God's help, we can start to choose the narrow road, the narrow gate, the road that leads to life. Because we can't get there on our own. We need God. Choose the narrow road. Choose the smaller gate. God will help you through it. The Holy Spirit will help you through it. Okay, let's move on to verse 15. Is that 13? Yeah. No, 15. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown in the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Jesus right here is telling us how to watch out for false prophets. Because on the surface, false prophets, that's how they work. It appears as if they're godly. It appears as if they're getting words from God. So people are going to be deceived. And why? Because they're not looking for the false prophet's fruit. They're just looking at what they see and maybe hear and not testing it, not testing the spirit and not really looking at the fruit. What is coming out of that? What is being produced? Not just the words that are coming out of their mouth, not the way they look, not the godly appearance that they have, or the charisma, which is what people do. They follow. That's why celebrities make it so big. That's why they can make so much money, because people are drawn to that. But does it really amount to anything? No, not really. Celebrity status is exactly that, a status. It has no substance to it, right? But yet, people hold that as if it were full of substance. And that's why celebrities have that type of status in this world, especially in America, right? So we've got to understand that when it comes to false prophets, people saying they're talking for God, but actually they're against God. You're going to know them by their fruit. That's how you're going to recognize them. Well, this is the problem. And it's not really a problem. It's just you have to do some work. You have to do some research. There's no real way that you're going to be able to recognize them and figure out what type of fruit they produce without doing some research, without spending a little bit of time understanding what they're all about. So before you totally jump in with anyone that claims to be a prophet of God, you're going to have to do your research. You're going to have some proximity. You don't have to have physical proximity, but you have to have some proximity to gain information, to collect information and intelligence, surveillance, to find out the true fruit that this prophet, quote unquote, is supposedly producing. Because if you spend enough time doing some research, doing your surveillance, you're going to find the true fruit. I remember when I used to do surveillance, a lot of years I worked narcotics and I worked fugitives and gangs and all that stuff. But during those times when I conducted surveillance, you get a lot of information about somebody. And one of the reasons why to conduct surveillance is to gain information on whether or not this person is abiding by the law. But you're not going to see it just by in passing, like you see them at the mall, just walking by them at the mall, walking by them at the neighborhood, driving by their house. You're not going to get any information that way. They're going to get by. They're going to slip by. There's no way you'll find out if they're doing wrong. And this is an officer's perspective. Unless you surveil and get intelligence and gain information and get proximity to collect that information, from them and others and from your own observations. That's how you're going to make a true judgment on whether or not, in this case, a false prophet is truly, if a prophet is truly a true prophet or a false prophet. That's how you're going to recognize them. But you got to spend some time to research. That's what Jesus is saying, because a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. So you will be able to recognize them by their fruit. All right? So when it comes to prophets and they're speaking for God, that is where you're going to know whether or not they are true or not. And there's plenty of false prophets in the world. And Jesus later on in Matthew is going to tell us that's how so many Christians are going to be deceived. They're going to be deceived by false prophets who say they are the Christ. And they're not. So be careful. Understand what you need to do. Surveil. Collect information. Gain that information before jumping all in. Okay, let's move on to verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Okay, he's clear again. He's saying the same thing. Jesus is saying these people are true prophets. People are true prophets when they are doing the will of my Father who is in heaven. That's how you're going to know. That's the fruit. Because you see, when they have the fruit of the Spirit, it's going to overflow, right? One good way is out of the mouth is the overflow of the heart. Jesus says this. And if that's the case, then you listen to someone long enough, you're going to start hearing things that are not of the Spirit. If you know the Spirit, if you know the fruits of the Spirit. And if they truly have the Spirit of God, that fruit will continue and match up with the fruits of the Spirit that's listed in the Bible, in Galatians. And so that's how we're going to know. The fruits are going to tell you. So you got to listen in. Out of the mouth is the overflow of the heart. Okay? So listen up, listen good, collect some information, and do surveillance. That's how you find out. And then he says, hey, many on that day will say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not drive out demons in your name? Just because they supposedly prophesy in the Lord's name, does it mean they're doing it for the Lord? Nope. They could be doing it for themselves. They could be doing it for money. They don't have to be doing it for the Lord. Only the Lord knows their heart. And again, the only way you'll know them is by their fruit. And then he says, hey, we did all these miracles. And Jesus says, I will tell them plainly, very clearly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoer. So what that says is, even though they know they're not speaking for God, even though they knew it all their life, they're not speaking for God. But then when they're presented with God, with Jesus, he's going to tell them plainly, I never knew you. All they're trying to do is they're trying to manipulate. Didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we drive out demons in your name? Didn't we perform many miracles in your name? Jesus is going to say, nope. You thought you did it in my name, but you did it for you. And was that really real? Doesn't matter. You weren't doing it for God. I never knew you, is what Jesus says. Away from me, you evildoers. Very clear. Next verse 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his roof on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Again, another obvious one. Good parable. Again, it's clear. What's the rock that you want to build your house on? Jesus. Jesus is the rock. You build it on his foundations. Well, what's his foundations? The law and the prophets. And then the New Testament is what he lived. That's the foundation. That's his word. He is the rock. So you build your house on the rock. If that's your foundation, then no matter what comes, whatever storm comes your way, you can handle it, your house can handle it, your foundation can handle it because it was built on the rock. If it's not built on rock, then it's built on sand. If it's built on sand, it's going to wash away. It's going to come tumbling down because it doesn't have a good foundation. You need the foundation of Jesus, the Word, in order to build your house on the rock. And you really have to do it for the right reasons. Because if you're trying to build it on something, saying it's the rock, saying it's Jesus, but you're just being, again, a false prophet, you're saying all these things that you're doing in Jesus' name, but you're truly only doing it for you, then you truly aren't building your house on the rock. You're building it on sand. So don't do that, because when the storm comes, you're going to get swept away. All right, final verses here. Verse 28. Here we go. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. A couple of things here. First, he's teaching crowds, so multiple crowds. So this is a lot of people here, okay, on this mount here, Sermon on the Mount. And then they were all amazed at his teaching. Why were they amazed? It says they were amazed because he taught as one who had authority, not as teachers of the law. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the teachers of the law, you got the Sadducees, you got the Pharisees, you got all these guys who were supposedly teachers of the law, who were not teaching with authority. Why? Because they didn't truly understand. That's why they were teaching the law, but they weren't teaching it with authority, because they didn't understand it. They were confused by it, but assuming that they knew it. They assumed they knew it. They were just reading the words on the pages. They didn't understand it in their heart. They didn't have God's understanding when it came to this stuff. So when they taught it, it was literally like the most boring class you've ever been to. When it's a class that has no a training class, a college class, high school room class, whatever. Whenever you're in a class that has no relevance to you, it has no information that's usable to you, or you were forced to be there. Like sometimes you're forced to be in classes that you don't want to be in, but you need it for a degree. You need it because your job says you need it. How much do you actually take away? And then when you have to teach it, how much information and energy do you put into it? Not much. You can tell teachers that want to be there and want to teach, they are passionate about the subject and they know a lot about the subject. This is Jesus right here. He taught as one who had authority. The only way you can have authority is if you know the stuff. If you kind of know it like the back of your hand, then you teach with authority because you understand it to another level, way deeper than your fresh new students. And the only way you're going to do that is if you love the subject. If you are one with the subject, if you have studied the subject, if you have lived the subject, experienced it, all these things have to be in place in order for you to teach with authority. Jesus had that. One, he is the Word. He wrote the Word. And so he teaches with authority, not like the teachers of the law. And I love that. Jesus is teaching like no other person taught this Word, because he is the Word. Thanks for coming by. This is the Liberty Podcast. I'm Clint Armitage, and I want you to keep staying safe, staying motivated, and keep seeking liberty. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@clintarmitage.com.